Everyone, can you hear me? You can hear me, right? Okay. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Exempt Setting Committee of Board of Behavioral Sciences. And today is September 12, 2018. The time now is 10:07, and we're at the Department of Consumer Affairs in Sacramento. So let's have Christina to establish a quorum for us.
Good morning. Betty Conley.
Here.
Christina Wong.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. And let's do introduction. Let's start with Betty.
Betty Connolly, LEP member.
Kim Manson, Executive Officer for the Board.
Christina Wong, LCSW member.
Sabina Knight, Legal Counsel.
Roseanne Helms, Legislative Analyst with the Board.
Christy Berger, Regulatory Analyst for the Board.
And our audience, your introduction is optional. And if you choose to do so, please come up, say your name and your organization. Thanks.
All right, David Jensen. Exempt. Janley Wong, NASW.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to the discussion item, and this is in regarding registrant employment by temporary staff agencies. And I believe it's Christy.
Yes, thank you. So at the last three meetings, we've discussed this topic. It's registrants who are typically being placed at the Veterans Administration through a temp agency. And so we've looked at this language, and at the last meeting, we thought that we were done with the language, but we got some additional, well, first of all, AB 93 passed and it made a small text change in an area that needed to be changed to match. And then we got some stakeholder feedback after the meeting as well that what we were informed about is that despite the temp agency maybe even paying an individual, they may not always be considered their employer. So it's kind of a legal gray area, and so we've removed any references to them as employer, but it still preserves the intent of this language, which is to clarify that the registrant can only perform services at the places permitted by the contracting agency, which is where they're providing services, and also to ensure that the written agreement pertaining to supervision is between the contract agency and the supervisor, as opposed to the temp agency. So we removed any references to the temp agency as an employer, and so that's, and then we made the one minor change to be consistent with AB 93.
Minor changes, but have a great impact,
Yeah.
employer, not employer, or employee, not employee. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, board members, Betty, any feedback, any comments?
Nope.
The language looked really good. Looked really good to me. So, public comments, any discussion, any comments?
Very complicated issue. I guess I'm still confused, though. At the end of the day, who actually is the employer of the unlicensed person? I think that's got to be a major concern of what we're doing. That's one issue. The employer issue is always going to be there, whether it's in the the text or not. It is a very complicated issue. Just on July 13th of this year, the U.S. Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division issued a guidance memo about the registry problem. And they get into about a 10-page analysis of factors that are going to shift who is the employer. And it can change depending on the actions of the one referring or the one receiving, right? So the idea of who the employer is always going to be sort of a slurpy kind of a concept. And my fear here is that we start out one direction, who's signing off, and then something happens, a court case or maybe a determination by another governmental entity, that one really wasn't the employer, it was the other one, and then what happens to the unlicensed person's hours at that point. So to me, we can't, it's not like a shell game where we can pretend that well, if we just take the language out, that issue doesn't exist. It's always got to exist with an unlicensed person, because they have to be a volunteer or they have to be an employee. And at the end of the day, they're gonna have to turn over to you guys, right, a W-2 from an employer if those hours are gonna count. So this is complex stuff, right, but just in terms of placement, I mean, they got 2 pages on issues that may arise with bad placements. Is the registry using only objective criteria? Are they getting into more subjective criteria? The more they start getting into subjective stuff, that might actually mean they're the employer versus just the contracting with the person providing the service. So I'm not quite sure we're there, because I think we still have some unanswered questions on this one. But at the end of the day, I just want to make sure for MFTs and LCSW associates and LPC associates that nobody loses their hours because of something funky that happens that they don't really have control over. And again, I think the most likely scenario would be if you got like 10 unlicensed people at a site, one of them screws up, there's a lawsuit, right? Any good lawyer is going to name everybody in the lawsuit, and if it comes down to, no, they're really the employer, not them, who's going to sign the forms then? How can we go back and so nobody loses their hours of experience?
So I want to address that a little bit. I understand that issue, and I understand it in terms of the hours, but in terms of this written agreement and the reason for having the written agreement, I feel like that is kind of a separate issue. I feel like the way this is written, it just tells you that when you have to have a written agreement in place versus when you don't. So when a temp agency gets involved, it's just making sure that they can perform services only where the contracting agency says you can perform services, and that the supervisor has access to the records. So it's kind of narrow to the written agreement. And I feel like that's a separate issue about the hours.
Right. But
So-
we got to think about it.
But it is definitely an issue. I mean,
It
it
is an
is a
issue.
concern, yeah.
That's the thing. We're not going to be surprised 3 years from now. We're going, oh, geez, that's what he was talking about, right? Because again, at the end of the day, we can see they've got to be able to produce that W-2.
Right.
And without it, and if there's a determination that we thought A was the employer, but really B's the employer, they're not going to sign that stuff. Their people didn't supervise it. You're tough out of luck at that point, which we would hate to see happen. Hours are incredibly valuable and important to associates. So because there's this slurpiness aspect to the law regarding employers, the concept of employers, I mean, hence, a field memo, right, from the U.S. Department, Wage and Hour Division about how complicated this issue is. They can't even give you definitive guidelines. Everything's case-by-case basis. No factor is more important than the others. We'll look at all this stuff, in context. But people wrestle with, especially with these registry type settings. So to me, whatever we could do to include, to think about, that contingency, but to provide for the viability of the hours, I think would be appreciated by associates, down the road.
Thank you, David. Go ahead.
Question. Christy, do you think there's any value in adding a definition of employer in that section?
It wouldn't belong in this section specifically, because this is solely dealing with the written agreement. But I think in the statute where we talk about, and I can let Roseanne chime in on this, I think that might be the better place. Or, I mean, it could be a regulation, because it's defining something in statute.
Okay.
It just would be a little bit of a separate deal from this. So I feel like this language could go ahead,
Go forward.
but we work on this other
Right,
very complicated
right.
issue. But
I mean, yeah, because in my mind, I think, especially in these situations, the employer is really the contracting agency for the most part, because that's where they're performing the services.
I mean, and we could, yeah, I mean, that's something we could say, if a temp agency is involved, they're always,
We could consider that. Yeah, what are your
I don't
thoughts,
know.
Roseanne?
I think that we could define it as, for the board's purposes, the contracting agency is considered the employer. That's in a very narrow concept, because defining employer in general in the law, there's a lot of, that's kind of stepping in it, because there's a lot of controversy going on right now with the Supreme Court case about what is an employer versus an independent contractor. So I don't think that's something that we're going to be able to resolve. But if we had a really narrow definition with an in a contracting situation for purpose, for the board's purpose, we
Purposes.
consider this the employer.
And it could go in that section easily, just in one of those.
And it can?
And
Okay.
also, my only concern also is about, if, let's say, the, whoever, provide the wages, to the intern, if they give them a 1099 form, that becomes like, in the tax law, become an independent contractor. And so that kind of hours, should, will violate, whether those hours will count. And so it's a little bit more complicated. So I'm a little hesitant, to put some sort of parameters and say that, yes, 1099 will be, counted the hours if you're in a temp agency or, or something like, I think it's just really muddy. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
Darlene with the Board of Behavioral Sciences. Okay, so I have 2 points to make. Okay, so one of them, what we take from our regs is it does say that the employer is a setting in which you lawfully see clients. And that would be, I believe it's in 1870 where, I have to find it, and I apologize for not bringing my book. But the other point is on the W-2s, we have gotten the information out there to, some of the staffing agencies have, they used to try to sign for the hours or for the letters of agreements, and we've indicated to them, well, their employer is a setting in which they lawfully see clients, so now they're submitting W-2s from these staffing agencies, but in addition, from the employer saying they were hired through a staffing agency was totally acceptable to us when we reviewed their hours, and there's clarity there in all points, because, ultimately what the goal is to protect the consumer, so I don't know if that kind of sheds some light on what you guys are talking about here. I'm sorry for attending a little bit late.
No.
Always get caught up over there.
No, you're the one that sees it,
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
yeah.
But the staffing agencies are aware that now they have to be the W-2, because they are the one who are placing them. So they are now providing W-2s. Some of them still provide 1099s, and that's where the employer has to come in and say, hey, we hired them through that staffing agency. So, but as far as where an employers where they or their setting where they lawfully see clients, I'll have to find that for you. I know it's I believe it's in 1870. I'm not sure.
Which
Yeah,
one? I got it.
1870.
Do you want to grab this one? I mean, you could go ahead and,
Okay, yeah, and I'll-
yeah.
I've got 1870.
Yeah.
It's,
Okay.
which section are you talking about?
I believe it's on Article 1870. Let me sit down for a second.
Okay.
I'd just like to add, based on what Darlene said, to piggyback on that, I think that what she said is very helpful because it kind of shows the issue. If it is an issue, if some are still getting confused in providing 1099s,
Yes.
maybe we just say explicitly in here that a 1099 is not acceptable and that if we want a W-2 and a volunteer letter, who it has to be from. And then it's crystal clear. And there's no confusion. If there is a question, we can point them with the temporary agency right to that section.
Okay.
Jan Lee?
Jan Lee Wong and ASW. Actually, I was going to say a little bit of what Darlene was saying and what Roseanne just said, which is you already have policy regarding 1099s and W-2s. So it's clear that if it's a 1099, no, not an employee. And I think the idea of clarification is important. And getting the word out, which it sounds like Darlene has been doing, to the temp agencies and the registries, like, here it is, clear, black and white, 1099, no, W-2, yes. And making sure, it's important, as Dave said, that some people may not understand, some of the registrants or the associates may not understand. We don't want them to lose hours, so making it as clear as possible to them that you better be getting a W-2, or we're going to have problems. And I think that hopefully that will take care of this, even though it'd be interesting to me to see how you could get a W-2 from a temp agency and a W-2 from the contracting agency, so that would be really good.
They're for sale on the internet.
Good point.
And on the other hand, I think, it's equally the responsibility of the associate and also the supervisor, to really reiterate the fact that, okay, I can sign off your hours, however, you have to submit W-2 form, and how, and I'm thinking that, through the supervision process, the public education process, at least, they can figure it out, that, to prevent that, they're not submitting a 1099, and so the hours don't count. And yet I think what we're trying to do, at least to clarify, the two roles, between the temporary agency and then also the contracting agency, and allowing them, to collect hours. And that already brings some clarity that, that this is, the setting that's permissible, to collect hours. And I think that's already, one big step forward. Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. It doesn't say word for word your employee. However, this is what we give them when they say, well, that is my employer. And then we, because, they're trying to sign a letter of agreement saying that they're authorizing supervision. When we tell them that their employer is responsible for their work environment, because the supervisor is responsible for reviewing client-patient records, whatnot. And then on number C in Article 6, 1870, it just says monitor and evaluate the ability of the associate to provide services at the sites where he or she will be practicing and to the particular clientele being served. So we kind of stick to that when we're explaining to the staffing agencies, that is their employment. That's their employment setting where they're lawfully seeking clients. So we kind of, are strong on that. So that kind of saves us. And we do have great samples that we've been collecting from some of the employers where they have authorized the supervision from somebody who isn't employed through them and have been, they've hired an associate through a staffing agency. So, and then some of the outreaches that we go to, we've had some of the staffing agencies attend, and they come and ask us directly, and this is what we tell them what we're looking for. So we're trying to get the information out there, and it seems to be, slowly but creeping in. Okay, thank you.
Oh, one more thing on that. I think that because this has in the past been an issue of confusion for some individuals, if we had, and this regulation section is pretty short and sweet, if we had this if we were to put in there the clarity about where the W-2 came from, or whatnot, we could easily put something on the website too, under temporary agencies, and then we could just have this there, and it's pretty self-explanatory if you read it, and then somebody that's trying to figure it out ahead of time, which is what they should be doing, it's all right there, they know, and hopefully that answers all their questions right off the bat.
So if we were to put it there, what language would you think about?
Well, before we get to language, I just want to, just a couple more little things. I want to make sure, I know you haven't gotten back up to speak yet, but after I read that bulletin, and I don't know that who issues the W-2 matters as far as if it were to get to that point, but if we say for purposes of, counting hours, the W-2 is the end-all be-all regardless of what, you know what I mean, like,
Exactly.
okay.
That was less, right, what's been done, hours are gonna count, problem solved.
Okay, and it could go in this section, you guys are right, it could go here. So it would just be a section in regs about temp agency employers in general. The statute already says it has to be a W-2, but I guess we would just reinforce it here in regs is what it would be.
The statute,
But just-
for, the employment, nature of, definition of employment and work. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So,
Well, here's what I would suggest. Why don't we know that that's the direction, or it appears the direction that the committee would like to go in. So maybe we take it back, we craft it, we work with Sabina, and then the next bite of this apple would be at policy and advocacy
Yes.
in October. And then we
Right.
can come out, that way we're not crafting it on the fly.
yeah, I would prefer to do that and
think
really
that's-
think about, for purposes of county hours, it must be a W-2, but we're not going to, like, are we going to say who the W-2 has to come from? I guess it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter where it comes from.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just a simple sentence that just reiterates what the other, because it's not, the other law isn't speaking explicitly to temporary agencies, and temporary agencies are more likely to want to issue a 1099, that we specify that the applicant, when they're submitting, has to provide either a W-2 or a volunteer letter. And we can be silent on who that's from, but it's got to be from one of them.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. I think that's it.
I think that's,
Does that work for
So-
staff?
so that will work for staff. So, so I like the idea that, we can bring it back, to the next policy and advocacy committee meeting, and basically in reference, back to, whatever the section that they need to know, to clearly understand that, what, when they submit the hours, the documents that the board will be looking for and approve. So,
Yep.
yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Do we need a
Sounds
vote on
good.
that?
Do we need to, what's that?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right.
All right.
So any other public comments or feedback from board staff? And okay,
All right.
very good. So, and I want to thank, David, that is a very, very, legitimate point, not just about, in terms of, the nature of the agency or the employment, the employer, the potential lawsuit, and how do we also not just protecting consumer, but protecting the associate, But it's a broader discussion than what we can handle. So, yeah, but thank you so much for bringing it to our attention. Yep. And so let's move on to the next discussion item, and that is in regarding practice setting definitions. And it's
Yes.
Christie again.
Yes, thank you. So we've worked on this a couple of times, and so we're working on the definitions to help clarify acceptable practice settings for students and to implement some consumer protections in exempt settings. And so I'm going to skip over some of this because we've already talked about it quite a bit. And we know that most exempt settings are doing a good job, but that our surveys show that there are some that are not fingerprinting and don't have a complaint process or a licensee supervising. So we considered some proposed language that would require unlicensed or unregistered therapists working in an exempt setting to provide consumers with a disclosure before initiating psychotherapy that informs them how to file a complaint about the therapist with the agency. We also looked at language that would require all settings in which psychotherapy is performed, including a private practice, to provide a disclosure about how to file a complaint with the board. This is already a requirement for other health professions, including psychologists, physicians, and dentists. So so the committee agreed with it in concept at the last meeting and directed some changes to the language. So the minor changes are that, let's see, from last time, they're pretty minor. So clarifying that for the exempt settings about the complaint being filed is clearly with the agency, so we specified that, and that the notice has to be provided before initiating psychotherapy. Under the notice to consumers, the text of it, I am suggesting deleting the individual's name because that may change and there may not be an individual's name. And then at the last meeting, we wanted to take out email and include website address instead because emails can change. And then under the notice to consumers for licensees in non-exempt settings, we changed it to say, instead of complaints regarding the practice of psychotherapy, instead saying regarding services provided within the scope of practice for, and then the profession. And then we also deleted the email address and we just left the website and phone number. So those are the changes made to the exempt setting language. And Roseanne had one more very small change, is that instead of saying the must provide consumers with the notice, we're going to change it to shall, just for, that's more how laws are generally written. Yeah, exactly. So are we okay with that concept? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go on to the for-profit business entities and those definitions. And we didn't get quite as far last time. We had a starting point. And we're defining private practice, which includes professional corporations, separately from other for-profit settings. And this is especially important for the student practicum placements. But we're also going to have to go back. Attachment B has all the lists of laws that reference private practice currently, and I did go through them, but I feel like once this definition is completely final, I need to go back again with a fine-tooth comb and just make sure. So once we land on that final definition, actually Roseanne suggested that, and I think it's an excellent idea. We need to be super careful. So we went over this quite a bit before, but I'm going to go, bear with me, I'm going to go over it again just because it's a little bit complicated. There's a lot of information. So let's see. So a couple of things to consider before we finalize these definitions. We had originally considered, private practice corporations, any for-profit to be in one definition, but we decided that if other types of for-profit businesses were included in the private practice definition, it would basically, schools could no longer place students in those other for-profit settings. And right now, we have 42% of programs who are placing students there, and 30% of schools don't have enough placements for their students. And then if the for-profit entities were added to the private practice definition, it would subject those type of companies to all the laws pertaining to private practices that we have in Attachment B, which may or may not be a bad thing. That's an open question. And just because schools are currently placing students there, it's something that, we really need to consider. So I want to just go over again what the other for-profit business entity types are. So you could have a company that's owned by an individual who is not a licensee. You can have a partnership, which can be multiple owners, a combination of licensees or non-licensees, or one or the other. You have general stock corporations. I gave an example a couple meetings ago of Telecare, which is an employee-owned general stock corporation, and then Health Net of California, which owns MHN, an employee assistance program. So those are a couple of examples. I'm sure there are many more out there. And then David Jensen brought a couple of other types of corporations to our attention, so these weren't listed before. We now have public benefit corporations and flexible purpose corporations, and those are interesting because in a general stock corporation, the primary responsibility is to their stakeholders and making sure their stocks are doing well. In these corporations, they have more ability to consider other types of positive things that the company is doing, as opposed to just making money. So positive things in the community. And those are, I guess, newer in California law, a newer definition. So the types of services that for-profit companies include are mental health clinics, substance abuse recovery programs, and medical settings such as hospitals, medical groups, nursing homes, hospices, and dialysis clinics. Most of these are regulated by the state of California. Actually, all of these three types that I just went over here, well, more than three, but the medical settings, substance abuse, and mental health clinics are all regulated by the state. The amount of regulation really varies, but they do all have some sort of oversight. So kind of back to talking about student placements. We haven't been made aware of any specific problems other than a couple of people in the survey mentioned that the substance abuse placements sometimes are not broad enough to get students the right type of, to get them a broad spectrum of exposure to different clients. So that was the one concern we heard, but that doesn't mean there aren't other issues. And so Roseanne and I were talking, and really, we're just kind of racking our brains. Why is a private practice not okay, but why are other for-profits okay? So we're trying to kind of get our head around that and really want to make sure before we kind of come to this decision that we've really thought it through. So I want to come back to that question. Again, so corporations, the concern about them is that their primary responsibility is to their shareholders, not necessarily the patients. But in the mental health field, there's not as much profit to be made, so maybe that's not as big of a concern. And also, they have to meet requirements of their professional liability insurance, which would include the need to offer effective treatment to their clients. So there are some things that balance that out. The way we've written it, it would still allow students to gain, or to be placed in other for-profit settings while maintaining that restriction on private practice. But I just want us to maybe discuss a little bit more whether for-profit settings are okay. So I think one way we could do that is, why is a private practice not okay? What are those reasons? And so I've been kind of trying to rack my brain on that. And I was, I have a couple of ideas, but I was wondering if anybody else has some thoughts as to why isn't a private practice okay? Janley, you might have some history on it, but then the social work profession doesn't. David, yeah, we don't regulate your students at all. I don't know if David, why is a private practice for a student not okay? So.
Boy. I mean, by default, right, I'm a camps historian. I think I'm the longest.
Oh, good, okay.
Yeah. Except for some of the folks that work on the administrative side. I think Mary Reimers always explained it as it was the profit sort of problem, right? So the nonprofit setting, the government setting, you didn't have the profit, angle. They're always concerned about what happens when suddenly, consumers are paying. They wanted more oversight, control on that side of the street. But, that's going back, her explaining, I think, my first week on the job 17 years ago. So, I'm surprised I can still remember that. But that was always the idea, is that they saw the for-profit pond a little bit full of, murkiness, wasn't as pure as the nonprofit, side of the street. But, obviously society's changed tremendously. I go back to one of the first meetings I went to 17 years ago, and you had the, drug and alcohol people on one side of the room and the therapist on the other side of the room. They wouldn't talk with one another, and everything was silos, and dual diagnosis is the way to go, right? So you've seen this incredible merging of these sorts of, programs and services. But with that comes, right, then the challenges of how do we all work within these, within these systems. The one thing I did want to point out, I think Christy and Roseanne did a fabulous job. And this is like really difficult stuff. They've always been open, which is really great. I think one thing I would quibble with would be in the substance abuse side. The state does license certain facilities, but some can operate without state licensure. So you always have that dichotomy. Too, right? So we may be, controlling the license, but there's still a whole set of entities out there that aren't necessarily, cleared by the state, that still are acceptable sites, I would think, because they're still doing the dual diagnosis kind of stuff. But in terms of the for-profit, that was it. They wanted to sort of minimize the financial gain aspect to it.
My thought, too, is maybe they're not exposed to a range of clients in a private practice. You might get more of a narrow focus, was my other thought. And I know for registrants, that 6-year limit on private practice, I know it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons I think is maybe there weren't enough private practices to go around for interns to get experience in. I also know it's because you don't want professional interns, just constant, But those were my other two possibilities, but without a basis in, in the historical record. And those were just a couple of guesses.
Jim, go ahead.
Janley Wong, NASW. Both settings, private practice and corporate, are regulated when it comes to the hours, the supervision, and many elements of consumer protection. So they're similar in that respect. The difference is that in a corporation, it's regulated by business laws and business practices. And in a private practice, you really don't have a lot of regulation as compared to a corporation. So this idea that the corporation has to be controlled comes from a long history, business history in the United States. And I think it's allowed for those reasons. One of the reasons I already mentioned, this idea that sometimes the consumers served by the corporate entity are different types of consumers than private practice. In particular, the corporate entity could contract, sometimes with fairly large contracts, where you have probably more of an employee-based clientele than you might have in a private practice. You'll have that in the private practice too, but the corporate design sometimes is focused on contracting. So I don't know if the board needs to get into all these details because, and again, I agree with Dave, the staff's done a tremendous job in trying to simplify and clarify this, but we don't want to necessarily go off in that direction because the board doesn't regulate business. You know, that's done by another state agency. So again, if we feel the basic elements, hours, supervision, and consumer protection are covered in both, and there's recourse, of course, there's always the complaint recourse, et cetera, then I think we're okay. I think what's happening, though, is Dave gets, your staff gets a lot of questions from licensees about, well, what is this corporate, or I want to incorporate, or I want to do this. And it's not a simple question. You know, I don't think it is, because I often tell these licensees, I say, well, it's really about how you want to operate your business, and it's really about taxes. If you think about it, the tax structure is different for individuals running their own small business as a private practice than it is for corporations. So you don't need to be talking to NASW. Sure, you can talk to CAMP because they got lawyers over there, but you really should be talking to your tax attorney and your accountant and whoever you have income with, because the tax issues are different in either structure. So again, I think if you've got this basic stuff covered, I'm not sure you need to head off into the, well, what is a corporation? Which one is okay and which one isn't?
So Roseanne and Christy, does it help, to answer some of your questions, the stakeholders' feedback?
It does for me, but I know.
A little bit, but I think we still have the question of, defining these different types of settings and specifying what is acceptable under, we have all these laws that say, okay, if you're in a private practice, you can have this not many number of associates, or you can't, work in a private practice on a second number. So what settings can you work on in a second number? We have we have like exempt settings on one side, and then we have like other, which we're trying to define as the other for-profit settings. So I think we need to like really be careful in the law to specify where this third group, the other for-profit settings, fits, and what are the rules pertaining to them.
Okay.
It does bring up a good point about private practice and the question of why, which has been sort of the mantra every time we go through our laws. And, we look at something, why is that happening? But it's the same with the private practice. I don't have a good answer when the registrants call and say, well, why can't I? Other than, the law requires it. Especially when you think about how things are structured now. I would think 20, 30 years ago, it was, Kim hanging out her shingle, that's my private practice, and then you worked everywhere else. But now, as Jan Lee pointed out, a lot of it is just tax structure. So, and I'm thinking of one individual in particular who worked at an agency, but it was kind of considered a private practice, and it was not able to get into the clinical exam and get it passed in time before that 6 years ran out. And so then had to leave those clients and ultimately became licensed, but it didn't feel right to say no. And so that's just, I think that might be the bigger question is there any harm in leaving them to work in a private practice?
Jan Lee?
So from just my anecdotal historical brain here, The concern about private practice is, as I said earlier, it's not as regulated as a business. Businesses are much more regulated than private practices. So the thing about a private practice is we want to curb any potential abuses in a private practice. But since you cannot regulate a private practice, nor can you regulate a corporation, you can regulate how many people can work in a private practice as registrants or associates. And you can say that on the second registration number, you can't work in a private practice. So that's the board's way, historically, of controlling or regulating private practices. And the fear is there would be abuse. You know, private practitioners, as wonderful as they are, and 99.9% of them are super cool, except for that 0.1% that you guys see on the complaint side. You don't want any possibility that registrants would be abused by private practitioners, overworked, just doing things where they border on the unethical, they're exploited, they're kind of like in some sort of, this is extreme, but neo-slavery or something. And that's how you control private practice, how the board historically has controlled that issue in private practice. And it sort of makes sense in a way because we don't really know how a private practice operates. And as you're indicating, sometimes they go off on a hybrid and they're sort of in between this and they're in between that. Versus corporations and businesses, generally speaking, in good business practice, they have annual reports. They might have a board of directors. They might have other mechanisms that you can monitor what they do, who they serve, how their employees are treated. But in a private practice, you don't have that. So I think that idea of trying to take a proactive position by controlling what happens in private practice vis-a-vis the associates or the registrants is really the historical reason for that.
My only counter, it's not really even a counter to that, it's just also commenting that those types of abuses happen in all settings as well. So, and I think when we first started this committee, I think I might have talked about this. There was one nonprofit that I'd seen had one licensee and like 20 students and interns under that one person. So, but when you have, but at least with a nonprofit, you do have a board of directors.
Right.
There is some oversight.
Right.
So, as opposed to a private practice where there is nothing other than us.
Yeah,
David?
David Jensen Camp. Yeah, I would agree with Christie. Just because it's a nonprofit doesn't mean there ain't trouble.
Yeah.
We had a whole agency in San Diego County go down a few years ago when the supervisors came to the interns and said, we need you guys to basically do chart notes. Here are my notes. No, we need you to do notes for patients you didn't see. And are they going to allow you to state that you didn't see the patient and this is done like a year later? No, they want us to write it like we did the services, right? And in 1 week, we were flooded with calls from interns about that issue and, told them all to resign. That's fraud. And then, a couple of years later, you start seeing the supervisor cases, rolling through the BBS. So there's no guarantee. There's never any guarantees. To me, because of all the emphasis on private practice, though, we kind of have to go one way or the other. We either have to have 1 hours of experience, right? Open up everything, right, to everybody. I don't know how many private practitioners would take on trainees because of the liability and the supervision sorts of issues. They probably still would settle at nonprofits and those sorts of settings. Or we got to go with the 3. Because the 2 is the one that really isn't working right now for some settings. And I have to apologize. I think I kind of indirectly contributed to this mess a few years ago when I wrote the article. All we were trying to do was show that, hey, there's for-profit options that are out there, in terms of sites as well as nonprofit. But the way the private practice rule is written, it emphasizes ownership. Right, so if an MFT owns something, it was then transformed into private practice, and that was, I think, in retrospect, sort of a half-baked, naive kind of idea. As I point out to Christy, if an MFT owns a hardware store, that's not a private practice. That's still a hardware store, right, because of what it does. We all have a sense of what a private practice is and what it does, and I think we have a sense of what a drug and alcohol rehab place is and what it does. And they're really not the same. And just because an MFT owns one, it shouldn't be a private practice if somebody else can own it, right? It shouldn't flow like that, because that's where I think the ambiguity starts creeping in. So to me, because of the emphasis on private practice, all the limitations, all the restrictions, if we're going to retain that as a concept, I actually like what you guys have done. We have 3 categories instead of 1. But I'm sitting here thinking, wow, a universe where there's just hours of experience, that might be a whole lot simpler to navigate and to manage. Always going to have the problems. There's no doubt about it. There's fraud. There's all that's unfortunately. But to me, it's 1 or 3. We got to get out of the middle, because that's where the ambiguity is right now.
And I want to thank David. He was immensely helpful on helping me fine-tune this definition and really think through the issues. And, it's really important how we make these definitions, and without his help, it would not we wouldn't be at this point, so greatly appreciated.
And I also want to just say that, working in the field, the definition, if you just look at it simple, in a simple way, it actually makes sense. The private practice, really, the general understanding is that it is, belong to, some, it's a business nature that, belong to the licensees, and then they primarily provide mental health services. But let's say if I provide mental health services and also, with the bar, then you wouldn't think that, that's a mental health services. So, so it's actually pretty clear that, we're solely referring to, to those services. So I think, even just, an initial attempt to clarify, to provide a definition, I think this is a wonderful start. And, so, I guess that, regardless, all these complicated issue, we may not be able to solve it right away, but at least it will be, the step towards the right direction. And if it does happen that, it becomes more confusing, I'm sure that, that will become another topic to discuss down the road.
Yeah, I would say the way it's drafted right now, I would be able to answer a question today that I wasn't able to answer yesterday. And we just got an email yesterday from a member. What private practice? Where can I work? I'm on the 6-year, kind of a problem, right? Well, if it's truly a, MFT-owned private practice, like we would consider, right? Can't do that, right? You foreclose that ability right now, but it opens up these other sorts of entities, and we can guide them, as opposed to saying, keep your fingers crossed and, hope it all works out in the end. So this, again, I commend you guys for what you've done. This is much, much better, much more clear. We can work with this. But I'm intrigued by that idea of, wow, let the market, kind of dictate. There's always going to be supervision. There's always going to be oversight. But that would be dramatic overhauling, of the system. But anyway. Yeah, it works. This works. Again, I could answer a question today I couldn't answer yesterday.
Okay, great.
And I guess also, Christy and Roseanne, you guys are trying to really consider an intended consequence, whether, it's going to open up, a whole lot of other, possibility of, whether it will be licensee or associate practicing, not counting their hours, or whether we're allowing more corporate, to become more murky. So I guess that, we don't know, but at least I think for now, now it's, I'm so glad that you guys are, keeping an eye on it and knowing that, that's, it might bring more, more complication because of this language. But again, I don't think that we can make a very, I think this is close to perfect. And so, close to perfect, yeah. And then I think we can, certainly, again, bring it back to, the PNA meeting and bring it back to the board meeting, we can open up some more discussion and yet, and if all the board members approve it, I think at least we have something.
Sure.
Yeah, we have something to
definitely.
begin with.
Okay,
To
good.
work with, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
One more thing.
Yes.
Oh, did you?
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, no, this is kind of, I just wanted to say that, I also want to point out that we also created a private practice definition for LEP, and as well as other for-profit setting, and it's almost identical except for how we talk about the scope of practice, and I just want to make sure, Betty, that you were, that it makes sense to you. Yeah, on the LEP side.
It's going to apply to us too much unless some of the changes happen, like we were talking about.
It's fine.
So you feel like the,
Yeah, I don't think it's going to apply a lot in that LEPs, unless we're allowed to supervise some of the licensees, this could at that point become relevant, I think. But that's a work in progress. I mean, that's kind of far off at this point.
there are some laws in the LEP, and maybe when we go to PNA, I'll point out which ones are specific to LEP that talk about private practice in other ways, like what I provided in attachment B, more like the general laws. So like, for example, the second bullet from the bottom in attachment B, it's unprofessional conduct for an LEP when employed by another person or agency to encourage the employer's or agency's clientele to use the LEP's private practice. So you're seeing someone at a school and you're trying to get them to come to your private practice, that would be,
Okay, but that's already covered, isn't it?
well, private practice is not defined. So we have
I
this
see.
law about that, but there's no definition, so I want to make sure. But we'll go back through and look carefully at all of these laws in attachment B, now that we feel like this definition is maybe solid, and we'll make sure to pay attention to LEP and how that might interact, and bring that to PNA, so.
As long as I have the mic, could we just look at the language? I don't know, maybe it's just me that's bothered a little bit by the way C is written in all of it. I'll refer, if the employer so we've got an if at the top, a school or an institution that's both nonprofit and charitable if, and then we've got C, if the employee or volunteer is not licensed or registered with the board, he or she provides consumers. It just,
Oh, back in the exempt setting
yeah, I'm
definitions?
still struggling with the language on that. It doesn't feel like, the others are very clear. This chapter shall not apply, blah, 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 if his or her work is performed solely, if he or she performs those functions. And then it's like, if the employee is not licensed, he or she provides consumers with the notice. So it's unclear to me if that means that it doesn't apply to them if they provide the notice? Is that what we're trying to say? Do you see where I'm
Yeah, I
going
think we
with the
struggled with
language?
this, definitely.
It just
It's,
seems like the language is confusing the way it's written.
it's specifying what keeps a setting exempt. So if they didn't, meet A, B, or C, then we
Yeah.
would no longer say, well, then you're not meeting the requirements of being an exempt setting. So,
I think it's the second clause in that. It's like, this chapter shall not apply if the employer or volunteer is not licensed or registered with the board. But then it goes on to comma, he or she provides consumers with the notice. So it's,
okay, so maybe C needs to be its own.
the first part of that is crystal clear.
C1, A, and B, yeah, definitely
But then it
flows. C
rolls-
doesn't flow.
It rolls into after the comma. It's like, what does that apply to?
Right,
There's already an if.
right, yeah, I noticed that too.
Yeah, it's if, yeah, right.
And even disregarding that if, it's still, the part after the comma, it's like, it's just not clear to me.
So you don't have problem with the concept, it's just how it's worded mainly?
It's,
Okay.
yeah, it's,
Okay.
for somebody who doesn't understand what we were trying to make clear in that,
Yeah,
I'm not sure that section, and it's duplicated throughout. You know,
yes, for each
It
profession.
runs through all of the licensing types, so,
Right, so I'm thinking something a little more, it's, if consumers are provided with the notice described in paragraph 2, when the employee or volunteer is not licensed or registered with, maybe turning that sentence around a little bit. That's just one thought there, to make it flow a little bit better.
Actually be a separate, would this be actually a separate paragraph?
If it's a separate we could, but the reason it's there is because it's defining what makes a setting exempt. So,
and maybe that's why that second part of that sentence doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
It makes perfect sense down below when it says if you're going to do that, you have to provide the notice. That's fine. But it's like the second part of the part on top doesn't seem to me that clarifies an exempt setting. The part about if the employee or volunteer is not licensed or registered with the board, yeah, that's real clear. But then it goes into that confusing second half of that.
I think we could maybe make C a 2 instead and say
That's a separate, yeah.
any employee or volunteer not licensed or registered with the board shall provide consumers
There you
with
go.
notice described in paragraph 2.
Yeah, and I think we just need to take out that second part after the comma, because I think that confounds the concept.
after the comma,
So,
The comma of the board, or?
the part on the top, that if a governmental entity, a school or an institute is both nonprofit and charitable, if the employee or volunteer is not licensed or registered with the board, period. And then, as Roseanne said, he or she, if that's the case, if they're not registered with the board, then an individual providing psychotherapy who is not licensed must consume blah, blah. So, I mean, we already say that down there, but that doesn't contribute to the clarification of the setting, to me.
Okay.
it's unlicensed practice then, because that your setting's no longer considered exempt. So like if you didn't meet the requirements of A, then you're unlicensed practice, right?
Right.
C1A? Or if you don't meet B, that's unlicensed practice, because then now you're no longer in an exempt setting. So I was envisioning C as in line with those first two paragraphs, and because really, we call them exempt settings, but really, the way this law is written, this chapter shall not employ to an employee or volunteer working in any of these settings if they meet these requirements. So it really doesn't say these settings are exempt, period. It's talking about the employees and volunteers working there.
I'm wondering, to Betty's point, I mean, is it, since 2 talks, it really goes into real clear detail?
Mhm.
Do we need C? Or if we just,
Yeah.
the employee, or, you know, we don't do anything after the comma?
Right, so,
That would be right.
but that again begs the question, then what, if we didn't have it in C, just having it in 2 is not part of that
Oh, I see.
definition
Oh,
of
you're trying
what's
to
an
make it
exempt.
inclusive.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it inclusive because otherwise, what would you go after the person for? If it's in C, I feel like it would be in line with what you could do for A or B, which is unlicensed practice. So C, you know, if we just left it in 2, I feel like it's more toothless that way, but I don't know, Sabina, what your thought is on that?
Is this one we might need to take back and revise and bring to P&A?
Possibly.
I think it's a matter of just cleaning it up, because, you know, the thing is here, you know, and I'm reading it, you know, even for, you know, for C1C, you know, that statement, you know, it seems like it's a duplicate, you know, to 2. So, you know, so I'm actually thinking that, you know, if you take out completely C, you know, and then, you know, just having 2 as a separate one, or even just to add an individual who is, an employee or, a volunteer providing psychotherapy, blah, blah, blah. And then I think that would suffice, to cover both.
Seems redundant.
Yeah, it seems
Seems
redundant.
redundant, but what I come back to is what would we do if somebody was not providing that notice? How, is that different from this appearing in, if we got rid of C, which is part of that definition of this employee or volunteer is exempt from licensure requirements. If we got rid of it in C, but we just left it in 2, that's not tied to, or maybe we need more of a preamble and then 1 or 2 below it.
I would get rid of the 1. I had just have the C
Okay.
be the start, get rid of the 1, have renumber, have A and B, and then the first sentence is kind of like an overview, and then everything else is a subsection. Does that make sense?
So get rid of C1, we leave the
Get rid
text.
of 1.
Yeah. get rid
Yeah,
of
and then
number 1.
have A, B, C, or A, B, your 2 bullet points, and then,
And then somehow combine C
and
and
then a
2
combined C or
into
2,
a number
yeah.
3. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
I think that could work.
Right, right.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments? Word crafting is always fun. Roseanne?
well, I wanted to go back to the language about the definitions. I think that the next step that we have to consider, if we're happy with the definitions for now, is that we need to go back and look, and it sounds like we're from the discussion, from what I got out of it, that we're okay with leaving certain things like 6-year rule just for private practices, but we need to think about the other laws that are shown in attachment B and kind of ask the question for each one. Where does the new other for-profit setting definition fit into this? It's kind of a question for each one. Like if you look at the active military, you can't work in a private practice. The question becomes, should they be able to work in another for-profit setting, yes or no? And then do we need to say that? So that's kind of, I think, for the next meeting. We need to go through that, but that's kind of the next step.
Right. So the next step would be, you want to discuss here, or would that be, will the staff look at it, or?
Yeah, we would look at it for sure and, analyze each one,
Yes.
provide like a little,
No bourbon.
Yeah, I think we need to look at each instance separately.
Right,
and
right.
kind of,
that kind of begs the question, does this committee need to look at it again or?
Or,
I think that it's just my personal thought on this is, I think we've brought this about as far as we can bring it in this committee. I think with the direction today and prior direction, I think we have enough to go forward to P&A. And even if we hash it out a couple of times at P&A, I think that would work.
I wonder, so we talk about the legislative cycle, so it's okay, right?
Oh, yeah, because P&A is
time.
coming
It's
up.
first time, okay.
Yeah, it's the first time. And, if we don't make it for the, to seek an author this year, we still have the second bite of the apple the following year. So I'm not as feeling as rushed to get this one through.
I think that it's a possibility. We don't want to rush this one. I think that
Right,
the
no.
consequences are we want to make sure we have it, kind of in the books and we feel comfortable with it, because there are potential unintended consequences. But I think we have a P&A meeting in October. We could potentially bring it back to the second P&A in January or February. So there's the potential, our first board meeting in March is the beginning of March. So the potential for legislation still is on the table if the board were to approve it then. We could get a placeholder bill and try to run it either as this year or as a 2-year bill. So I don't think the door is completely shut unless if the board doesn't approve language by March, then I'd say the door is shut for the year on it. But we can kind of leave it cracked open until then as a possibility.
Okay. So as far as we're able to, to not need to wait another 2 or 3 years, and I think that will be fine. Yeah.
I'm pretty confident we'll have approved
Right.
language well before that.
And I think, the PNA meeting, in October is pretty light, assuming, right? Maybe? I don't know.
Reasonably.
Reasonably
We
light,
got Omnibill and
right?
it,
Well-
Yeah, it's not as heavy as an April or spring meeting. I'll
right.
say
no,
that.
absolutely.
It's not going to be light.
It's
but
not going to be light, but it's not, I would say medium.
Okay, so in that, the whole point being is that, whether, we will have sufficient time,
Yeah.
to discuss that.
Sure.
But it looks like,
I think so.
I think after, Roseanne and Christie, you guys look at, kind of, the implication, with this definition to all the other references, I think, I'm pretty sure that, you guys will bring some pretty good pointer,
Yeah.
to, and to really think about, again, any other unintended consequences. So I think it would be a good place to move forward.
Okay.
And it seems like it's also expanding to one more step. Now, this committee worked out all these definitions, and then the next step is like when we incorporate into the other, how that's gonna go, what are the areas of concerns that can
Right.
be identified.
That's a good
So I
point,
think it
too,
would
and,
be good.
yeah, and
Yeah.
plus, we're going to be dealing with all the private practice issues, and people might not come to the exempt setting committee, but you'll have more people at P&A who might,
Yes.
contribute to that discussion
And you'll
that
have,
wouldn't normally come to this one.
different board members
Yeah,
listening to it as well. So I think I would encourage us to move
To just
forward
move forward,
move
yeah.
forward to
Okay.
P&A.
I think it's
makes
fine.
sense.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay.
So, looks like both items, we do not, we just bring it back for the staff to continue work on it. And I think that's it. So that's the two items. All righty. And so now, so the next agenda item is suggestion for future agenda items. Okay, and Darlene?
Darlene with the BBS. I was just wondering if that issue ever came up about the redaction on the letters of agreements on client center, our client confidentiality purposes of record sharing with supervisors reviewing client-patient records, but the employers do not want to, they want to redact. So that was an issue we brought up in our meeting, so I didn't know if that was covered or not.
I think we're going to be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I probably didn't, I know I copied Sasha on the email, but I
Oh,
don't know
okay,
that you
okay.
got it, so I'll send that to you.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
They were happy.
Oh, good, okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
Okay. Any other suggestion for future agenda item? Okay. Public comments for items not on the agenda? Seeing none. Okay, so I guess it's time to adjourn. The time now is 11:14. Thank you very much. And our next board meeting will start at 1
Yes.
today. Same venue. Thank you.